when I came across this case of the Strachowitz factory slave labor camps, again, this was a aspect of the German occupation that had been vastly understudied. One might say that they're hiding in plain sight. And while we would hear about them in the survivor testimonies, they're not central to German documentation because it's the companies that are running them. And you might get the SS having the columns of numbers of laborers they had sent out, but not specifying, each camp and so forth. And the main source from my work was the survivors of the camp. And so that was one thing. The second was to illuminate Jewish survival tactics, the decisions they made about how they coped in a position of utterly asymmetrical power. How do you stay alive when all the power is on one side and all the weaknesses on the other, but you don't give up? And so the ways in which they tried to find how could they work the system. One of which is, of course, try to make yourself indispensable to the German war economy. And as workers became increasingly short during the war, trying to find ways in which they would deal not with the SS because they're distant off in Radom, but how you deal with the factory owners and the factory managers to make conditions better in the camps. They improve over time instead of getting worse, and to keep people alive, which they were relatively successful. And the third was you can trace through that how German policies changed. Through the eyes of the survivors who were experiencing the impact, how did the Germans make choices between their conflicting priorities of killing the Jews, but winning the war, when winning the war required a successful war economy, and one of the main threats to a successful war economy was a labor shortage. You can't both work your workers and kill them at the same time. So how the Germans sorted that out and in fact arrived at different conclusions in different places was also one of the things I tried to unlock in the book. This would become a case in which you could test in this area, and the Radom district was one in which survival in labor camps was higher than in most areas. How, in fact, did the Jewish laborers manage to insert themselves, in a sense, at that point of leverage, even though they were a targeted and utterly hopeless or helpless and very unequipped to struggle for their own survival, but found ways to do so nonetheless. Walter Becker was the police commander in the town of Strachowitz. The Jewish community lived in the adjacent Jewish town of Wierbstedt, which was where the ghetto was. And Becker, as the police chief, was in charge basically of the local arrangements for the ghetto clearing on October 26, 1942, when over 4,000 Jews are sent to Treblinka on one train, and there are no survivors, and about 1,200 Jews were sent into one of three labor camps in the town to produce munitions, either the shell casings or the loading of the grenades and shell casings with gunpowder, or the lumber mill where they made the crates in which they packed all of this to ship them. So there were three, and there was the iron foundry where they sort of made the shell casings, and then there was the munitions part, and then there was the lumber part. So we had three camps, three functions. After the war, Becker eventually, he, like so many of the others, went into the police after the war, was eventually tracked down and brought to trial. And unusually, in so many of the issues we've got, of course, there are no Jewish survivors, or one or two. Here, there were dozens and dozens of survivors available to testify against Becker because they had gone from the marketplace where they had gathered people to clear the ghetto and sent 4,000 people to Treblinka. And in the post-war period, there was nonetheless dozens of people who through the labor camps had survived that were willing to come back and to testify. So it was an unusual German trial in that you had not a handful of witnesses, some of whom might have very bad memories, traumatized and whatever, but you had dozens and dozens of witnesses. So for the court, which had a judge not anxious to convict, the question was, how do you possibly, dismissing one or two witnesses is one thing, dismissing dozens of witnesses is another. And as I read this judgment, I I was appalled, but not only appalled, I was increasingly angry because of the absolutely pernicious miscarriage of justice that this represented. Whole categories of witnesses would be well, first of all, the very notion of eyewitness testimony he dismissed to begin with. Of all the kinds of testimony, circumstantial evidence, written evidence, material evidence, eyewitness testimony is the weakest and most fallible form of testimony. Secondly, a good eyewitness has to be disinterested, intelligent, dispassionate, uninvolved, a neutral observer. Well, these are people who were testifying about what happened when their families were murdered. So by his definition, these are bad witnesses to the fate of their own families because they are passionate and involved and not distant and uninvolved and dispassionate. So he basically throws cold water on all of them to begin with. And then he goes on. If you were young then and are now a mature adult in the court in 1972, well, you were too young then to observe intelligently and know what was going on, even if you now are a very mature adult. If you were an adult then, now you're too elderly and your memory is too bad, so you can't be relied upon either. So no matter what your age group, you were either too young to begin with or you're too old now, so your testimony can be thrown out. And he went through all sorts of these things to disqualify all of these witnesses. In the end, he had a couple of people who were so unimpeachable, including the son of the head of the Jewish Council, who Becker had beaten personally on the way to the marketplace. And the judge says, well, in the rest of his story, he speaks with such calm sobriety, but when he got to that part, his voice tightened. So we can't exclude the possibility that at that point he's no longer telling the truth. His voice tightens when he's talking about being nearly beaten to death when the rest of the Jews are being all sent off to Treblinka. And that disqualifies your testimony. This was paragraph after paragraph. It was the most extraordinary judicial document I'd ever read. So my first motive in all this was I was just furious that Becker may have been acquitted in a German court, but I was going to acquit him on the bar before the bar of history. As I got into it, I got fascinated by the use of survivor testimony, which the judge had dismissed, and trying to show how reliable it is, particularly when you can cross-check among 292 different accounts, and in a sense disprove not just Becker, but the judge himself. And I finally thought, well, I have to check out who this judge is. He was one of the very first judges appointed after the war by the British in North Germany, which was the British occupation zone, because he didn't have a Nazi Party card membership. He hadn't been in the Nazi Party. Most of the judiciary was a highly Nazified profession. There's no way you could have staffed the German judiciary in the post-war period if you excluded all the people who had been Nazis. He was one of the first in because one of the few that wasn't. And I said, this doesn't make sense. So I just on a hunch looked into the SS files. And there was a file with his name on it. So I cranked it up with the microfilm of the National Archives. And the file was empty except for a couple of little note papers. The first said the file has been removed to the safe of the Reichsführer SS Himmler's adjutant. So it was obviously taken out for some special study. And the second of note said that the judge's application for the SS had been turned down due to his non-Aryan ancestry. So this was a judge who wanted to be not just a Nazi, he wanted to be an SS man, and some Jew had sneaked into his family tree and ruined his Nazi career. He wasn't going to forgive the Jews for that. and so that suddenly this all made sense, that we had a very bitter man who was going to preside over this totally egregious miscarriage of justice and could do it because he had no Nazi record.